My name is Norm Volsky, your host, and this is the Digital Health Heavyweights Podcast. Welcome to the Digital Health Heavyweights Podcast with your host, Norm Volsky. And today it is my pleasure to introduce my guest, partner at Define Ventures, Chirag Shah.
Hey, Norm. Thanks for having me today. Appreciate you making this happen.
Of course. Very much been looking forward to this. So we'll just jump, right in with the questions. What was your background before you moved into the healthcare space?
I've been in healthcare in some way, shape, or form since I was probably 5 years old. So there's not a whole lot of background before that. I was in a variety of roles before being in the healthcare venture side. I was an operator at a couple of startups in the employer space for several years, was an investor in late stage private equity at the Carlyle Group, and was a banker in my early days. But healthcare has been a part of my life since as far as I can remember.
Tell me about the childhood exposure to healthcare.
I grew up to immigrant parents, and in the culture I grew up in, entering safe professions was really the prescribed route, and so that typically meant one of a few things. And for me, I found a lot of interest in medicine. By nature of who I grew up around, I spent a lot of time with physicians, nurses, really a whole lot of people in the medical field. My mom was and still is an echo tech, so she's been in the medical field for her whole career, and it was always fascinating and exciting to me. What doctors are able to do and what nurses are able to do with their patients has always been something I have been impressed with since as far back as I can remember. And so I knew from a very early age that it was something I wanted to be a part of. I didn't become a doctor, and I can talk about that for sure. But it's been as part of my life since I was very young. In fact, my kindergarten yearbook, when you look at the page, it says, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Mine says a doctor. My friends had like video game designer and astronaut. I had a doctor.
Yeah, no, I think we grew up in very similar cultures. There's always like a joke that if you're a, Jewish, kid, your parent wants you to be a doctor, lawyer, or accountant or something of the like. I know similar cultures, and I would say I grew up in a very similar environment in the standpoint that my mom was in nursing academics. She ended up being dean of nursing at a couple colleges. My dad was actually a medical malpractice lawyer. So at our dinner table, it was constantly healthcare as well. And I think that did, help me when I kind of moved into healthcare as a career. So tell me about, how you found Castlight / how they found you. You came from the banking world, and then, Castlight was your first time in the, pure healthcare space on the vendor side.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I found Castlight, I was working at the Carlyle Group. Carlyle is a massive private equity fund based out of New York, and I was focused on doing buyouts for healthcare companies that were somewhere between 1 and 10 billion in size, and massive organizations. And I knew that when I was getting ready to leave Carlyle, that I wanted to go to the operating side. I wanted to get a sense of what it was like to really be boots on the ground, helping build something, and getting a feel for what it was like to actually take an idea and a product from scratch and turn that into something that customers were excited about. I had a conceptually similar experience working with our portfolio companies at Carlyle, but I knew that my next step really wanted to be the next level deeper. And so this was back in 2011, 2012, when you Googled healthcare startups back then, you got really 3 or 4 different options. And when I did my homework on Castlight, the mission of that company was just absolutely incredible to me. The idea that you could show people what healthcare services actually cost and some semblance of the quality of those services was a totally novel concept. And Castlight did wonders for breaking open that market across the board. And everything from the mission to the people I met to the early folks that Giovanni and his group recruited were hands down among the best I've ever worked with. And so I found my way in incidentally through a competitor of theirs, met a whole host of people at Castlight and joined their strategic analytics team in the middle of 2013.
Yeah. Wasn't Castlight the first of these companies to IPO? Like before them, I don't think many, if any, did.
Castlight was definitely on the early part of that curve.
Mhm.
They absolutely broke open the market for healthcare data and transparency and consumerism in this space, and I think ushered in a wave of companies that are bringing a lot of these issues to light. So they were trailblazer in a lot of respects.
Yeah. When I did my first handful of employer sales searches for Livongo, it was like Castlight and who else, and they were partnered with Castlight, so I couldn't even pull people from there. Like if someone had worked at Castlight and left, so those early years were hard because it was a very shallow pool. Talk to me a little bit about your early years at Castlight. What did your team and you in particular do for Castlight? What did the company accomplish in your time there? In those first handful of years?
It was about 2013, and we were really in the middle of a few things. We had fully launched our transparency product. That was in
Mm-hmm.
market. That was being used by millions of consumers across the country, with really strong receptivity. We had data from a number of the payers, and we were still working on breaking down the doors for a few more. And so the big things for our company at that time were making sure we had the right data across the board to show the information we wanted to consumers who needed that information and wanted it, and also launching the products we were layering on top of the core transparency solution. Things that would help people select services and utilize the services beyond office visits, imaging labs, to create higher value healthcare experiences and to become the central source of truth for all the information an employee would need regarding their benefits. Benefits are complicated and confusing, as we all know, and there was a very large push from the Castlight angle, to be the place that people could go to, not just to figure out how much an MRI costs, but to figure out the details of their health plan, to help them figure out which doctor to go to, not just how much all of them cost, and to know when and why they needed certain services that they were being told that they might need to get. And so that, as you can imagine, represents an ecosystem of products and services around it. And so building out that ecosystem was a core part of our focus. And my role, for much of my time there, was figuring out how we communicated the value proposition of those products out to the market, and then being alongside our sales team as they did that for our prospects, our customers, and other folks. And so, as you can imagine, though, it was a pretty fast growing place, and I wore a lot of different hats while I was there. On paper, it was analytics, but in practice, I spent time in product, in marketing, a little bit in sales, in product marketing. I was really all over the place.
That's great. It's awesome you were able to contribute in a lot of areas. And Castlight was very helpful early in my, employer tech career because they did some of the vetting for me. My job is always to source the best candidates and then the best clients, so I can bring those candidates awesome opportunities. So I would just see who Castlight was partnering with and who was in their ecosystem. And I'd usually, use that as my prospect list at the very beginning as I was learning the space. So, the company did make my life easier as well, in certain respects. What were you most proud of in terms of your time at Castlight and what they ultimately accomplished?
Look, Castlight took on a massive, massive endeavor. I think before Castlight existed, there was virtually little to no way of figuring out some of this baseline data that people deserve about their healthcare. And the
Yep.
fact that they were able to do that for millions of people and transform that industry is something I will never forget. And frankly, I think the industry will never forget. We've come a long way from the early days of transparency. And I think part of the reason that that concept is embedded so deeply in virtually every plan across the country and
Mhm.
dozens of vendors across the country is because of the early work that Castlight did. And
Yeah.
being a part of that alongside a phenomenal group of people was an absolutely amazing experience.
Yeah. And I think it's even more in vogue, when it became popular to do high deductible health plans because
That's right.
the patient is actually paying out of pocket up until a certain point. So they're a hell of a lot more cost conscious than they were, maybe a decade ago. Um, so let's talk about your transition over to Imagine. What brought you to Imagine? and tell me about, that experience.
I knew when I wanted to become an operator that eventually I wanted to go pretty early and be able to quite literally take a product or an idea from the idea stage through full-on development and commercialization. And Castlight was reasonably established by the time I got there.
Mm-hmm.
And so over the course of several years, I had a great experience there, but had the opportunity to join some former Castlight colleagues who recruited me over to Imagine Health
Mm-hmm.
in 2016. And I think of Imagine Health and Castlight being on different ends of the same goal, in that Castlight was solving the supply demand imbalance in healthcare from the from the demand side or the consumer side. Imagine Health was going about that from the supply side, meaning how
Mm-hmm.
do you fix a broken system of provider incentives and employer incentives to deliver higher quality, better value care to employees? So Castlight did that by showing people data and creating the right UI UX around that. Imagine Health did that by restructuring contracts in the market and creating their own contracts to form the right network of providers so that employees, frankly, don't have to do the hard work of picking which doctors and specialists and hospitals to go to, because they were being served up the best quality ones in the market. And so when I got to Imagine, we had some of the groundwork and the frameworks for that. We were just in the middle of going live with our very first customer, the Home Depot. And I thought, being able to get into that company, close to on the ground before we had a massive Rolodex of employers would have been an amazing opportunity. So I was fortunate to join when I did. And we had a bunch of successes there. We sold a lot more employer lives. We were out in the market quite widely. We had built half a dozen of these networks across the country, and took that company eventually to an acquisition several years later.
Walk me through, what you learned most from your time at both Imagine and Castlight.
Yeah. Between Castlight and Imagine, obviously both companies were laser focused on selling into the employer market.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the ethos of both those organizations. What I really learned is how the best and brightest salespeople commercialize products in this space. I was fortunate to work with some of the best ones I think exist in our world, and watching them and being alongside them day to day was an incredible experience for me. I think on top of that, it was eye-opening seeing how the other actors in our industry came into the fold and the right
Mm-hmm.
way to work with them. We've got a complicated web of folks in this space, whether it's the payers, the brokers, the consultants, the providers, and frankly, the layers of folks on the benefit side, understanding how
PBMs,
all that.
TPAs. There's a lot
Yep.
of cooks in the kitchen.
There really are. And so understanding how all that fits together was absolutely invaluable. And so I think between knowing how to navigate those webs and how to commercialize within those was probably what I took away most.
And how does that experience make you a better investor?
One of the biggest things we want to help our founders do is build and grow their companies.
Mm-hmm.
It is by far the biggest thing that we want to make sure entrepreneurs know is that unlike most investors who will say, see you once a quarter at the board meeting, we
Yeah.
want to be talking frequently and often. We actually want to help roll up our sleeves, get you in front of customers, get you in front of prospects, help think through the strategy, really help build the company. And it's mostly because our team is full of operators. We've been on that side of
Mm-hmm.
the house. And so when I think about not just the companies in the employer world, but also ones focused on providers, on payers, on life sciences orgs, navigating any of those sales cycles and processes is not straightforward,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And so when I talk to entrepreneurs building in those spaces, the biggest thing I can provide them is frankly knowledge of how some of that works. Now, I don't know everything, and no one at
Mm-hmm.
Define or no investor does, but having been on the inside and having seen firsthand how you take an idea from really a slide deck through selling some of the largest employers in the country, and knowing how to navigate the web of incentives and folks around the table, I think is invaluable to a lot of entrepreneurs, and frankly will hopefully help them skip a lot of the steps that we had to take and hopefully take a couple of shortcuts that didn't exist when we were in those shoes.
That's how it's supposed to work. Why did you choose to join the venture capital world?
As you know, I was an investor earlier in my career, and there
Yep.
were a lot of things about that experience I really enjoyed. I loved the academic rigor of analyzing a deal. I loved working with our management teams. I loved understanding how these companies work at a deep and operational level. For me, though, part of the reason I went to the operating side is because by nature, I wanted to move fast. Like, I'm not the kind of person who likes waiting, and
Hmm.
I love speed. I love working with young companies. I love being at young companies for that reason because everybody is gunning and going in the same direction.
Hmm.
When I thought about my career after Castlight and Imagine Health, one thing that struck me, reflecting, was that I'd had a lot of different roles at both those companies. I worn a lot of
Hmm.
different hats. I really like the speed. I love the mission, but for me, I really wanted to be in a position where I could see that market more broadly. Uh, in some ways, wear all of those hats at the same time,
Hmm.
but also be able to impact multiple companies and multiple entrepreneurs simultaneously. So I put all that together with what I liked about the investing world, and early stage venture in digital health. Frankly, hit all of those bars. Um, and so when I moved back to San Francisco and got introduced to Lynn, and we talked about her vision for Defined Ventures, which at the time was in the middle of raising its first fund,
Hmm.
um, the combination of how she thought about the industry, my experience and background, and what I was looking for in my next role fit together quite well.
That's great. I love that. And why Define? Like, what about them stuck out compared to maybe others that you were considering?
Like I said before, digital health is a complicated world. And it's
Hmm.
complicated not just because of sales, like we were talking about before, but it's complicated because, or rather, also because this industry is evolving every day in terms of how it consumes and markets healthcare.
Hmm.
50 years ago, our healthcare system wasn't nearly as complicated as it is today. But you fast forward and you've got companies that grew up in the direct to consumer world now striking partnerships with the largest health systems and payers across the country, which was a concept that was
Hmm.
untenable 5, 10 years ago. And so when you combine, and so with that in mind, there's a few things that I think Define does exceedingly well and that are very much in alignment with how I think about the world and how Lynn really views Define go forward. One of them is at our core, we want to help our entrepreneurs build. That is what we are at heart, and we are the hardest working people on our cap tables, bar none. And so that ethos, I think, is quite unique amongst funds. Beyond that, I think we have a different view of the space. As I was alluding to, we've had over the years, um, not just healthcare companies get formed in this space, but consumer companies, but tech companies. And you put those three together, there's very few funds that actually understand the intersection of healthcare, of technology, and consumerism, and can
Hmm.
help entrepreneurs think through those incentives. I don't care if you're a company that is selling software to a payer, you've got to be thinking about how consumers actually use your product, like how your end
Yeah.
users are going to appreciate this, and how you build a product that is designed not in the 1980s by a stalwart in the electronic health record space, but how somebody in Silicon Valley in 2023 is going to build viral products that people love. Like that concept and fusing it within healthcare doesn't exist. And that's always been Lynn's vision for Define, is being at that intersection point of how you put those together with top tier technology to build products that people and enterprises love. And then I think the very last thing is that this is all we do. We
Hmm.
are only digital health. We are only early stage. And there is nothing else that is taking up our time. There are plenty of funds out there that try to invest in this space and they do 100 different things on top of it.
Yep.
This is it for us. And this is all we are ever going to do. So being singularly dedicated to a space that is this complicated and this involving, I think is absolutely critical if you're going to play where we're playing.
I'm grinning and smirking because that's my pitch to prospects. They're like, "Why you guys?" I'm like, "Well, we do only digital health. Tell me other groups that do that only, and you can narrow it down, and then
That's why
let's
you're
talk
good at
about
what you do,
everything
man.
else." So Really, really like that. You've been there over 4 years. This might be a
Mhm.
little preliminary to ask, but what are you most proud of in terms of investments you've made?
Look, we have the benefit of working with companies across the digital health spectrum.
Mhm.
I, by nature of my background, have spent a lot of time in the employer world. We also invest in entrepreneurs that are focused on payers, on providers, on life sciences, on consumers. And
Mhm.
the interesting thing about this space is that many of those worlds have blended together over time.
Yeah.
We invested in companies that were purely direct to consumer, literally just commercializing off of D2C and organic growth, and are now selling into employers. Like that, again, that's another concept that didn't exist 5, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
We're proud to be on the forefront of. And so I'll give you a couple examples of companies that span all of those markets because I think each of them is individually important. What comes to mind initially is Folks Health. Folks Health is a company that we incubated about 4 years ago, and
Mhm.
Folks is going to market initially direct to consumer and with hormone therapy for the trans community.
Mhm.
Um, Early on, we and the founder, A.G. Breitenstein, recognized a need for this group of folks who are routinely assaulted and turned away in the traditional healthcare system for drugs and therapies that they fundamentally need. And so we saw the opportunity to create that company, knew it was going to be something that would grow well beyond the trans population and hormone therapy. And in the last couple of years, it actually started to move into the employer world
Yep.
because employers are recognizing that that is a fundamental need that their employees have and want to cover those services. And so being a part of that arc and that trajectory has been pretty rewarding, especially considering we built that company from the beginning.
One of my
Like
industry favorites, Brad Nations, works there, and I'm assuming you work together at Castlight, and that may
we
be why
did.
he's over there.
Brad and I did work together over there. I was a huge fan of him coming on board, and was very excited about that. So it's great to see past lighters all over the place in our companies. Actually,
And I think a lot of people don't assume this, but it is commonplace and a really big advantage of taking investment from an industry specialist is that you can introduce them to talent. So because you know this market, because you've worked in the industry, you've got contacts, you have Rolodex, you can introduce them to really good people, which it sounds like in that case you did, which is fantastic.
yeah, I won't claim credit for the introduction, but I was
Oh, okay.
certainly a big proponent of making sure he came on board. To your point, though, talent is a huge vertical of what we do. We
Mhm.
actually have a head of people who serves as a people leader on behalf of many of our companies as they're building their organizations. Also, helps them on the recruiting side. But again, he's only been in digital health his whole career, and
Yeah,
so like the rest
I'm a
of us
big fan
only
of
knows
Karsten.
this industry. Yes, exactly. You know Carson as well.
Yeah.
And so we've been very fortunate to work with him. But to your point, some of our companies, I'm proud to say, have 3 or 4 folks who I used to work with at Castlight. Because to your point, like that's our network. It's people
Mhm.
who we know from having been in this industry for a very long time.
I love that. Any other investments? I kind of cut
Yeah,
you off and maybe
no,
ruined
no
your train
problem.
of thought.
Let's hit on a couple of more. So, TIA is another one that I think about from our early days. TIA is a full stack women's health platform that started by creating a brick and mortar clinic in New York to be the GYN of record for thousands of women. And that experience went fantastically well. And as you can imagine, if you're a clinic, you're typically recruiting patients through direct to consumer ads or through payers or what have you. TIA took a slightly different approach, and I'm proud to say this is in part because of a lot of the work that Define did. Um, TIA is actually commercializing with health systems.
Hmm.
Health systems know they need to attract a new type of consumer. And they know that women are a highly valuable part of the healthcare ecosystem. They control 80% of the purchasing dollars, and that's no secret to anybody.
Hmm.
And so they also know that hospitals and traditional GYN practices are not necessarily the most welcoming places for care.
Yeah.
And so TIA partners with health systems to be that front end of women's care,
Hmm.
and works in close partnership with Mount Sinai in New York, UCSF in San Francisco, Cedars in LA, and Common Spirit in Arizona. Um, really to be an extension of their four walls. And so that arc and that trajectory has been a lot of fun to see. And we still work quite closely with TIA today. On the pure employer side, we were investors in Centivo, which is a next generation and full stack health plan for self-funded employers and level funded employers. We've built markets across the country that leverage the highest quality health systems and providers in a market and commercialize that an end-to-end experience that frankly replaces Blue, United, Aetna, and Cigna, because it's a better quality health plan and a better quality product for both employers and employees. And then on the last end of the spectrum, we've also invested in companies like Lightship, which are doing end-to-end clinical trials, literally going to pharmaceutical sponsors and saying, you're recruiting for a 150 patient trial? Great. Give us 50 of those patients. We'll recruit them. We'll put them through the paces. We'll do this in a hybrid and in-person and virtual format, and we'll collect the endpoints that are needed in the most optimal way. Not every patient has to go to a health system site 4 times a month. We can do half this stuff virtually. We can do the other half in their own home. And you can actually improve your trial retention and recruitment because we're going to get patients in more diverse ways. So that's a bit of flavor from all over our investing spectrum. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, it's great. I'm glad you have some winners in the portfolio. I assumed as much. I'm a big proponent of, if you're not taking enough risks, you're making a mistake. So obviously, when you're an investor, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to have a handful that don't work out. Obviously, we won't name any names, but whether it's from earlier in your investing career or in this experience at Define, what have you learned most from, some of the ones that didn't go as planned?
I think as venture investors, we are primed to think about the world as it could be, right? That is a fundamental thing you need to understand, and not you literally, Norm, but like as someone in VC, it's core to how you think. Is like, I think the world is going to go in this direction, and there's a couple components to that statement. It's what is going to happen, how it's going to happen, and when it's going to happen. And if you're going to create a huge winner, you actually probably have to nail all 3 of those. Now, there's exceptions, and great markets build great companies, and great products sometimes win in this industry. And sometimes you can time things well and poorly. But if you're going to create a really big winner, ideally you've got all 3 of those things. You've nailed the what, the how, and the when. Sometimes you don't nail all 3 of those things. Sometimes you're too early into a market. Sometimes you believe that certain products and services are right for the industry because they're going to do better by patients, but honestly, the incentives aren't there yet. Sometimes you think that, consumers are going to decide to buy healthcare in one way, but in reality, that fundamental shift hasn't quite occurred because you don't have macro tailwinds behind it. There's a whole host of reasons why I think deals sometimes don't go the way you wish they did. But at the highest level, I think we can typically trace back to one or more of those few things.
Understood. How do you source deals? Where does your deal flow come from typically? And I know it comes from a lot of different areas, so kind of walk me through the different areas.
I would bucket this into 4 major categories. So one of them is our partners and our contacts in the market, folks like you, right? Other folks we work with a lot who are kind enough to send us entrepreneurs who are looking to raise capital. We work with a number of strategics as well, health systems, payers, employer coalitions, who will certainly send things our way. We do a lot of outbound outreach, because we do a lot of homework and we call thesis development work, parts of the market that we think are interesting. And we make it a point to go canvas the market and reach out to companies that we think could be interesting. Whether or not they're looking to fundraise, we just want to meet them and better understand what they do, how they do it, and how they think. And those are typically the major ways that we source deals. Entrepreneurs also find us. We get a lot of cold emails from people saying, hey, I read about your fund and I really like what you have to say. I'd love to talk to you. And so it's a combination of all of these things, whether it's our advisors and partners, whether it's our strategic relationships, our outbound work, or the inbound we get. But I would say all of those we have to optimize and balance because this industry is growing pretty quickly, and we leverage all of those to a large degree.
Do you ever get referrals from your founders, the companies you've invested
Absolutely.
in, and say, hey, this person I used to work with, or someone reached out to me asking for advice, and I think you should talk to them. I think they have a good idea.
Yep, we absolutely do. I put them in that first category of our partners and advisors. We
Okay.
actually call our portfolio companies partner companies,
I love that.
because we truly believe that this is a partnership. And so, absolutely, our founders are some of the best sources of that information.
That's great. Walk me through your evaluation process. When you meet a new founder and they kind of pitch you their idea and you're like, all right, that makes sense. Let me dig deeper. Like, what does that whole evaluation process look like?
Yeah. So remember that we are multi-stage investors. And what I mean by that is nothing is too early for us. We can talk, we are happy to work with entrepreneurs who literally have a slide deck and not much else, through companies that have a couple dozen customers generating 10, 20, 50 million in revenue and really looking to put more gas on the fire. And we work on both ends of that and everything in between. So for us, our investment process and what we look for differs along that spectrum of stage. It also differs depending on what exact part of the industry you're in. Meaning, are you going to employers? Are you direct to consumer? Are you something else? And so in broad strokes, we have created a set of criteria that essentially map to that matrix. Number one thing I will say that applies irrespective of which part of that matrix you sit in, though, is, again, we're long-term investors. We're in this for 7, 10 years with some of these companies. And our North Star is this good for patients? Is this good for the healthcare system? If it's not a clear-cut yes out of the gate within 3 minutes of talking to somebody, it's probably not going to be the right investment for Define. Beyond that, we really like to brainstorm with entrepreneurs about where they want to go with their vision, like where they think they want to take this company. We believe in creating lasting, sustainable change in healthcare, and we have our own views and opinions on how we think that can happen. And so for us, it's really important that we are aligned with those entrepreneurs on how they see the world evolving and how we see it evolving too. Now, for our later stage companies, we're going to spend some more time on the financials and understanding, what creates their go-to-market motion and operations. But investment timelines can take anywhere from gone as quickly as a week to a couple of months. And everything in the middle. It just really depends on what the opportunity looks like. By and large, I would say speed has never been an issue for us. We are typically very quick to move on opportunities. And we really believe, even when it doesn't work out, we believe in giving true and fair and fast feedback. I think the biggest disservice you can do as an investor to an entrepreneur looking to raise capital, and frankly, who's putting their career on the line to do so, is not being honest with them about why an investment isn't right for you. And so we make it a point to do that for every company that we talk to as part of our process.
In your evaluation process, is it really, hey, us at Define make the decision ourselves, or do you ask people outside of the organization for feedback, whether it's potential buyers or other advisors?
Yeah. We leverage our network quite extensively. So I would say the types of resources we utilize and types of, I'll call it data that we take in. One is everything that's coming from the entrepreneur, right? How they talk about their company, where they think it's going to go, what they need to build, who they need to hire and recruit and train. Typically, most companies have a data room of a bunch of assets that they've created, whether it's financial models or contracts or sales materials. We will then absolutely go to our partner companies. We'll go to our advisors. We'll go to just people in our network we've known for years. If there's a company selling to employers, I will happily go to some of the employer friends I've made over the years and say, hey, have you heard of this company? What do you think? Like, is there a need for this? Yep. If we have a company that's going to payers, we actually make it a point to introduce them to customers over the course of diligence and get a chance to see how they work. We call it a win-win-win because the entrepreneur actually gets a shot at a customer because it's a real live customer call. The customers, whether it's a health system or an employer or a payer, gets to see what's on the cutting edge because typically we're seeing stuff in its very early days. And we get to get a sense of how this entrepreneur sells because commercialization is so important in this space. So we do that for a lot of opportunities that we're looking at because we think it's a very fundamental and important part. And then, we'll absolutely go and do references after that. We'll dig into a bunch of detail around the business and the operations and the numbers, but we're leveraging all parts of our network to make that happen.
You mentioned earlier, that you really want to be a value-added investor. You don't want to just meet with them once a quarter. You're constantly in communication. Can you walk us through a little bit more of the value you and Define add to the companies you invest in and the ways in which you help?
Yep. I'll give you a couple of specific examples. So we are investors in a company called Found. Found is doing holistic weight care, both direct to consumer and through employers. We do coaching, nutrition, diet, exercise, physician appointments, medications if appropriate. And so Found launched and started direct to consumer. The CEO of that company is Sarah Jones Simmer, and she was part of the team that took Bumble public several years ago. And she knows the consumer world inside and out. She and we had believed for a long time that the enterprise was the right place to take that company. And you can conceptualize a few different ways to do that. You can conceptualize a model that you work with providers, patients who are contraindicated for surgery, PCPs who don't have the knowledge or time or resources to deal with weight care. You could conceptualize a world that does this through payers, through prior authorization and step therapy before getting to more expensive medications. You can conceptualize a world with employers whose employees are demanding these services because they are readily available through other channels. And so we did two things. One of them is work with her and her team to better understand and assess which of these opportunities made the most sense. And then two, helped her find a lot of the right people to bring around the table to make it happen. And so I think given Define's position in the market and our understanding of how these different organizations work, we were uniquely able to do that. And frankly, because of our talent network and the folks who we work with in our past, we're able to leverage that to get the right folks around the table for her. And I could give you that example, not just for Found, but for several other companies that we work with. But that's a pretty prototypical one for us in terms of how we think about that relationship.
That's great. What do you look for in a founder? Like, what are the things that you consider need to haves as opposed to nice to haves?
This is another one that really differs by stage and by sector. So let me pick a specific example because I think that'll be easiest to go through. Let's pretend we're talking to a very early stage company. Like I'm talking a slide deck, maybe a customer that they're trying to sign up, but not a whole lot else. And they're calling what I'm going to term a seed round. And let's say they want to go after employers with this product. For this example, it probably doesn't matter what exactly the company does, but here's how I think about it. I think the founder of that company needs to understand their product better than anybody.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't matter whether they're selling a reference pricing plan. It doesn't matter whether they're selling a virtual MSK solution. It doesn't matter whether they're selling diabetes care. They need to know that space inside and out better than anybody. Founders are really the experts of their products and what they have built. And typically that comes from their background and the work that they've done. But that's the need to have. And in the employer world in particular, having a sense of, or rather having a presence such that they feel comfortable commercializing and selling their product, I think is hyper important.
Yep.
This is not an easy world to sell in, even for the most experienced of salespeople.
Yeah.
And so I think for a founder and a CEO, being commercial in that way is absolutely critical. Now, do they need to know every single broker and consultant and every agency and mom and pop shop? No. We can help with that. We can make those introductions, and those are relationships that can be built over time. Do they need to know the ins and outs of how to sell into a 3, 5, 20-person benefits team? Some semblance of that would be good, but honestly, if you're hungry and you conceptually understand how this works and you're willing to learn, that's okay. We're never going to meet the perfect founder, right? The perfect founder is a myth. Everybody needs help with something, ourselves included. But we like to say that as long as you've got the right tools, we can supplement around that, right? We can be the people who introduce you to the right parts of the market. We can be the people who introduce you to your next COO. your CTO, your chief product officer. You don't need a perfect team.
Mm-hmm.
But what you need is a deep understanding of how your market works and how your product works, and the willingness to be out there in commercial and be the face of your organization. If you've got that, then I think there's a lot that we can work together to figure out.
Okay. And what would you give early stage founders, like someone who just has an idea, decides, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to start my own company? What advice would you give them? Other than it's going to be extremely hard.
That most people typically know. Not everyone, but most people typically know that.
Yeah.
I think in the very beginning, it is so important to think about three things. One is make sure you are trying to build a company, not a product, right? The products, I think, are a dime a dozen. Companies are a heck of a lot harder.
Mm-hmm.
Two is get inside your buyer's head. Talk to as many of them as you can and make sure that there is a need for this, that this is a real problem they have. There are lots of solutions out there in the market. There aren't as many problems as there are solutions. And so making sure you are building your company for a real lasting problem, it sounds like an easy thing. It's really hard to triangulate that. And I think the very last one is be honest about what you're good at and what you're not.
Yeah.
And early on, look for the right people who can help support you. Maybe you're a brilliant technical founder. If you want to sell into a space that is not highly technical, bring the right people around the table to help you support you do that. Likewise, if you are a top-notch salesperson, but product and agile development, and that's not your world, you know, do your best to figure out who can help you bring that to the table in the beginning.
Yeah, it's great advice. So we're going to move a little bit away as we kind of wrap up, away from, you know, your venture capital knowledge and, you know, what you've done in your career, and more just how you participate personally, you know, in health and wellness. So, you know, what do you do from an exercise standpoint or just, you know, general living standpoint where you're practicing what you preach?
Yeah. I will say this has shifted between before I had kids, which was 3 years ago, to while I had kids and COVID to now.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, for the better. I would say when I was younger, a lot of running. I ran a bunch of half marathons, a couple of full marathons. Loved doing that as frequently and as often as I could because it got me outside, it got me out of my headspace, and got me to focus on honestly nothing but the road.
Mm-hmm.
And I've started to do that a little bit more again, but that's what I used to do. And I should add to that, I played a bunch of basketball growing up that I was lucky to be able to do when I was younger as well. And then kids plus COVID changed things a bit. But as a bit of fortuitous luck, we got a Peloton about 4 months before COVID started. And that's what saved me from an exercise perspective for a couple of years. And so I continue to use that pretty frequently as far as my exercise regimen and my exercise routine. And like I said, I've been getting outside more and more as our kids are now a little bit older.
Great. Favorite instructors on Peloton? Who are your go-tos?
Yeah. I like Robin Arzen. I like Alex Toussaint. And I like Kendall Toole.
Yep. My wife loves Kendall. I'm an Alex devoted, you know, supporter. So, you know, definitely see those. Any other ways you reduce stress? Because I would imagine being a venture capitalist is probably one of the more stressful jobs. You mentioned, hey, we want to be the hardest workers on our cap table. You know, so how do you de-stress in a very high stress environment?
Go for a walk.
Yeah.
Just get away. Just turn off or
with the kids, without the kids.
Depends where I am. Sometimes I don't have a choice.
Yeah.
If it's during the workday, just get out, take a walk and get away and clear my head. If it's on a weekend, I love playing my kids in the park. It's actually very, in many ways, like de-stressing for me because I can focus on like throwing a ball or going down a slide, and not, the burning fire that's likely sitting for me at my laptop. So either one of those tends to work pretty well.
Yeah, no, all the time I spend with my daughter, it does like relax me because it just gives me the perspective I need. So, the other thing is I think exercise is great, but I think you have to pair that with healthy eating. At least that's my opinion, and I would assume most people in our industry would agree. Any healthy favorite recipes you and your family make pretty consistently that you would recommend and are some of your go-tos?
We are big fans of salmon and black cod at home, and
Ooh, I'm a big
they've
black cod
been
fan. For anyone who
yeah,
doesn't know, it's excellent.
it's great. And black cod was my wife's foray into fish a very long time ago, and so she's still a fan of that. But honestly, with either of those two, it's not that hard to make something tasty with a couple of simple ingredients, right?
Mhm.
Salt, pepper, some olive oil, lime juice, garlic. Like, you don't need a whole lot to make a tasty meal out of that, and throw in some roasted vegetables on a sheet pan, and you got a pretty good meal there. So it's not too hard to do, and it's certainly one of our go-tos.
All right, excellent. For any people watching or listening that haven't tried black cod, you should. And the best recipe I've found on it is actually Nobu, like the famous restaurant
Yep.
in New York, and now many other places. They have like a miso marinated.
Mhm.
It takes a little bit more work, but look it up. It is maybe one of the best things I've ever eaten.
So
Um,
that was her first fish dish.
Wow. Well,
That
she
was her
started off
entree meal.
really, really high, and
Yeah.
her bar must be like up to here.
Yeah, haven't quite been able to recreate it exactly, but maybe one day.
I love that. Well, Chirag, thank you so much for joining. Thank you for, stepping into the ring with me, and appreciate all the time. I think you gave some amazing insights for our viewers and listeners. And, thank you so much for joining the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast.
Thanks again, Norm. This was a ton of fun, and really glad to be here. Thank you for all the work you do for our industry.
Thank you for joining. Please like, comment, and subscribe below if you enjoyed it.